Well, I hate to do these reflections, but has this been an awesome day? Man, I'm so glad we're recording this. Obviously, these videos will be posted to our YouTube channel as well, which has been a pretty active place as far as subscribers and those who I know are going to be impacted, much less the chance to be here and hear these stories and to examine American policy and politics just through a different lens. And we're going to do that here again too. This particular panel actually grows out of an earlier event that we hosted as part of this American Project series back in the summer of 2019. It was dubbed the Social Capital Summit, and it was hosted actually on Capitol Hill with Senator Mike Lee's office. At the time, he was running an initiative called the Social Capital Project, and we had an opportunity for about 2/3 of a day to explore the different issues related to the creation of social capital. I've said, probably too frequently, that some of these themes that we're exploring around a communitarian approach to public policy really can't be measured or discussed. But in the field of social capital, there's a window into understanding these very important views and processes in public policy in a way that is both scholarly and policy related. And so I'm delighted that leading and organizing this particular panel is my good friend Ryan Streeter. Ryan is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And so without any further ado, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panel and this last conversation of the day.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. And thanks again for having us out, for organizing this great day. It really has been terrific. Really good to see some old friends and some people who've been around through the ongoing evolution of the American Project Initiative into its current form. And I think it really is making a valuable contribution for the reasons Pete laid out this morning. So it's great to be back with all of you. I got to say, following that last panel, what are we talking about again? If you see us floating around in the air up here and our heads bumping up off the ceiling, it's because all the moral gravity that was up here is no longer up here anymore. That was great. Thank you for being here, and Bob, thanks for organizing that. It's a really special thing to be here for this. In light of the remarks Pete made this morning, I think that James Q. Wilson's influence on probably all three of us is apparent in one way or another. I'm honored to have the James Q. Wilson Chair at AEI, the State Farm James Q. Wilson Chair, because they're the ones that make that possible. The Moral Sense came out just as I was in graduate school, and it had a profound influence on me, and I followed his work ever since that time. And I think we all are indebted to him and the special relationship he has with the school and the founding of it, and all of that is a really great thing. And also to the earlier panel, I also wanted to mention that, and I was talking with Dean Wilburn about this over lunch outside, that I know Pete mentioned the Roots of American Order course that's taught here. And the book by Russell Kirk was written here at Pepperdine all those years ago when he was taking leave with his family out here from their little home in Mecosta, Michigan, wrote that book here. I use a couple chapters of that in a course that I co-teach at the Pepperdine DC campus every summer, and that's an important part of the legacy of this school, and I think seeds of it even in this initiative. So it's really great, personally for me, to be able to tie all those things together. As Pete said, I'm with the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I'm really glad to be up here with two of my good friends and colleagues, John Lettieri, who's the founder and CEO of Economic Innovation Group, which is a think tank and public policy advocacy group in D.C. that's done a lot of really important work on understanding what's going on in America's cities, understanding really important questions about inequality, mobility, and all the rest of it, which we'll get into. And then my AEI colleague, Scott Winship, who was running the Social Capital Project for Senator Lee that Pete referenced back when we were at that event. And we've been lucky enough to have Scott come to AEI, and I've known Scott since probably 2007 when we were sort of on different ideological ends of a spectrum, and have both kind of grown, learning from one another, me more from him than the other way around ever since that time. So I'm not going to read the bios of them, but I would like each of you to say a little bit about why you're into this work when we first start talking. But what I thought I would do is talk about this issue of social capital, particularly when it comes to urban policy, when it comes to economic policy at the regional and local level, since that's what a lot of us, what the three of us often focus on, and really just try to understand prosperity at the individual and household level and its relationship to social capital, or social capital's relationship to that. In my own work, I've been focusing through my own work on cities, why some cities grow, why some cities lose people, what makes them successful. I've really taken to trying to understand what a dynamic society looks like. And I think of a dynamic society really more in the context of dynamic regions. Why do some places show elements of dynamism while others show elements of stagnation or decline? And I think there's three really interesting elements of a dynamic place that I think are consistent in a lot of the literature that you would read. One is dynamic places are places where people have a wide range of opportunities to fulfill their potential. One of the problems we have by having so many economists around us is economists do all kinds of complex analyses of things that you can measure. But there are a lot of things that are hard to measure. And so we tend to overvalue increase in wages. It's good to have, I prefer to have more money than less of it, but it's also true that money alone does not make you happy. And this has also been studied in various ways. And the effect of income on people's lives trails off pretty early on, actually, and other things contribute to our sense of well-being and purpose. And one of those things, kind of going all the way back to Aristotle, who was mentioned earlier, and I think profoundly evident in the works of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers and some of those that were mentioned today, is this idea that fulfilling potential, that sense of purpose that you get from being the best person that you were designed to be is something that really matters to people. And a dynamic place is a place that allows multiple avenues to that. At a practical level, that can mean having lots of different job opportunities within whatever field and profession you're skilled in. This opportunity to do more than just earn a paycheck, but to be somebody and to feel fulfilled in your life is a characteristic of dynamic places. A second one is really just distributed innovation and entrepreneurship, where you're not just seeing things starting in the coastal startup towns, but where in small places people are actually creating things. These could be companies, but these could also be nonprofit organizations. These can be places that are kind of creative by nature, where that learning on how to solve problems gets transferred in a community because you have enough people doing that and caring about those sorts of things. And the third characteristic, and I think this one is kind of counterintuitive because of where the literature has really kind of been over the last half decade or so, but that is really high levels of worker satisfaction, and particularly for working class people. There's been, I think the best work on this has been done by Edmund Phelps, who won the Nobel Prize in 2006, but also been replicated by others. When you look at economic data and you layer on survey data on top of that, and you find that people working hourly wage jobs are often the most satisfied with their job when they're in a place where there's lots of churn in the marketplace, or where you have lots of people starting things. And anytime you have lots of people starting things, you also have lots of things going away. And this notion of kind of churn is often negatively talked about as creative destruction, and is used as a source of creating instability in the popular narrative for working class people. But in fact, working class people in these communities generally demonstrate high levels of satisfaction with their jobs. Makes sense, because employers have to compete for your skills, for one. And you also live in a place where a lot of things are going on. And when we do survey work at the American Enterprise Institute, we do these large national surveys. And we have a definition of the working class that we developed with Brookings a few years ago, because everyone was talking about the working class but wasn't using a specific definition. So we did a very think tank thing. We met for a year, about once a month, and looked at a bunch of charts and everything, and then came up with a definition of the working class that we published. But it has the benefit of being sort of agreed upon in a bipartisan way. And we pull those people out of our surveys. We have found consistently, despite changes in the economy, despite changes in our politics, a really poisonous political environment, that working class, black, Hispanic, white, Asian, doesn't matter, generally want to live in a society where it's possible for anyone to start, build, and create something. And they also have a relatively high degree of confidence that in America you can do that. It's actually college-educated white progressives and increasingly college-educated white conservatives who think that that's not possible in America anymore. So the American dream is dying by the people who kind of control the microphone, but it's actually pretty alive and well, despite all the challenges that people face in working class communities. It's not that they haven't gotten the memo, they've refused to believe the narrative. And so what I think is underlying all of these three elements of dynamism, which is a much harder thing to measure, but some people like Scott have done a good job trying to do it, and he can talk about that. And in a previous life, when we were building the Prosperity Index, which looks at measures of social capital, we tried to do this, and a lot of other people have tried to study this, and we all learned from Bob Putnam all those years ago when he was turning the study of social capital into something of a cottage industry, that dynamic places also have rich associational life. And that's the thing that often doesn't get captured in the data, that when people are living in dynamic places, they're also in conversation with each other a lot. They're actually spending time at third places in neighborhoods and communities together, sharing their ideas. I know everyone gets sick of hearing about Austin, Texas. I lived there for a few years before coming to DC. And you just walk into any coffee shop, and you can't tell if people are working or if they're socializing. It's the middle of the day. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Some are drinking beer, some have coffee. The spillover effect, as the economists say, is just happening right in front of you. And new firms are being conceived and started and created right there in front of you. And it's that notion of trying to understand the relational network value of the kind of place we all want our kids to grow up in, a place where they have opportunities, where they can be satisfied, where they can find fulfillment in their lives. The most dynamic places always have this character of rich associational life. So I want to talk about what that means for policy, what it means for our understanding of how to make communities better that are struggling. And so I'd like to turn to my colleagues who have a lot more to say about this than I do. And Scott, I'm going to start with you to talk about your work on social mobility at the individual and the household level. And then John has really developed just an amazing body of data and research on what makes communities thrive, grow, or stagnate, and what the drivers are. So let's start at the household, kind of individual level first, and talk a little bit about what you've been working on over the years in terms of social mobility, and then also this element of how networks and associational life are related to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, why do you study this stuff? Why? You know, walk us through your.
That's a great question.
Through the bio.
Never thought about that.
Fill in the bio. That I didn't want to read the just read the bio thing. I thought it'd be easier to let you describe.
Well, thanks, Ryan, and thanks to Pete and to Rich. And to anyone else who scheduled us behind Bob Woodson's panel. Really great panel. Thank you all for the stories that you shared. Although Bob, the 4 white guys with data, was a little on the nose.
I felt attacked.
He said blue suits too, I think, didn't he?
There are only 3 of us, but. Let me say a little bit about how I got interested in what I do. I'm the director of poverty studies at AEI. Have, as Ryan said, sort of had an interesting path of starting pretty center left and moving a little bit rightwards over time, but sort of the whole way through being primarily interested in poverty and social inequality, social mobility to some extent. I won't take up the whole panel with my life story, but it's sort of, in 1992, I was a freshman in college, and the LA riots happened. And I grew up in a small town in Maine. Maine, at the time, was the whitest state in America, probably still true. Competes with places like Idaho. And but so I was going to school in Chicago, the LA riots happened, and I just became really interested in sort of understanding better how there were communities that had so much anger and alienation and what looked to me like a very unjust lack of opportunity. And so from then on, that's kind of what I've chosen to study, and that led to doing social capital stuff that we can get into an opportunity.
But you started out with Acorn, right?
My first job was with Acorn doing community organizing. So I was briefly not a man with data, but a man door knocking, and job was not for me. But I'm glad it is for some people. So let's see. I guess maybe I'll just start out by saying something about opportunity and social mobility. Just some big picture stats. In the United States today, if you, so imagine that you divide all parents with kids into 5 groups. So 5 equally sized groups. So the bottom fifth, the second fifth, the middle fifth, so on to the top fifth. If you start out being raised in the bottom fifth, your chances when you become an adult of remaining in the bottom fifth yourself, so having not escaped the bottom fifth, is about 40 to 45%, depending on the measure. Now, sometimes people will hear that stat and they'll say like, oh, well, you have a 55% chance of making it out of the bottom fifth. That's true, but folks tend not to move that far. So you only really have about a 2/3 chance of making it out of the bottom 2/5. So those are odds that middle-class families would never accept for their own kids, and I don't think we should accept it for kids who are raised in poverty either. You have a similar level of stickiness at the top, where if you start in the top, there's a very good chance that you're going to remain there in adulthood. Some fall down, but they don't fall that far down. There are big important differences in terms of race in the United States that reflects the history of the country. There are big geographic differences that maybe we'll touch on as the panel goes forth as well. But there's been quite a bit of work on what parts of the country seem to have better rates of social mobility and which parts don't. There's some evidence that is related to different levels of social capital in different parts of the country. And I think before we go too much further on a panel about social capital is one of those words that kind of gets thrown around a lot, very imprecisely. Even if you talk to academics, you talk to two academics, you'll get 2 different definitions of social capital. I think there's a lot of unnecessary complication of what the word means. It's got 2 words in the phrase, right? It's capital, which means something that's productive, that has value to people. If you have a lot of financial capital, you've got wealth in dollar terms that you can put to use. If you have physical capital because you own a factory or a computer, those are things that are productive for you. So capital is something that's productive. Social means it's about our relationships. So social capital is about the valuable aspects of our relationships and the value that you get from the people that you're networked with. By a lot of different metrics, social capital has declined quite a bit over the years. That's true whether you're looking at religious affiliation. Volunteering rates is actually an outlier because so many younger people are encouraged to volunteer in high school and college for credit. Volunteerism doesn't seem to have dropped, and partly it's because the boomers are older and they have more time and they volunteer more. Socializing after work has become rarer than it used to be. Spending time with your neighbors over dinner has become rarer. And perhaps most importantly, trust in institutions has fallen generally across the board, except in local government, actually, interestingly enough. And perhaps the most interesting way, most important way that social capital has declined is just in the sort of deterioration of the family that we've seen on any number of dimensions over the years. If you think that relationships have value, the most important set of relationships that probably have value to you in various ways is your immediate family. And we've seen the breakdown of the 2-parent family over time and lots of other indicators of deterioration there as well. That probably has something to do with lack of opportunity. It probably has quite a bit to do with geographic variation in terms of which communities have more higher rates of upward mobility versus lower rates. We can sort of get into all and any of that.
Talk a little bit about so much of your work and the work that a lot of people like to cite right now by Raj Chetty and his colleagues, the et al. In all the papers. I won't presume on everyone that everyone knows what Raj's work is, but you know him well, and he's cited you. So talk a little bit about his work as well, and what kind of implications you draw from it, just from your own work, and also what you think he should be focusing, talking about more, because I think there are headlines to this really interesting work. But some of it seems to get buried in footnotes. It's pretty important about the things that actually, when people are experiencing upward mobility because of things that they've done in their lives in the city where they live, there are certain things really contributing that to their upward mobility from their associational life that you found, that he's found, and talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, so Raj Chetty is an economist from Harvard. He's ridiculously accomplished, My joke was that he won the award given to the basically the smartest economist under age 40 in 2013, which was the year I turned 40. I never was in the running for that award, it's safe to say. Raj was 32 or something like that, so he beat the deadline by 8 years. But he's done a big project related to social mobility and where it's higher or lower across the country. The big takeaway, I guess, is the sort of southeast and parts of the kind of industrial Midwest that has experienced deindustrialization over the last few decades tends to have lower rates of mobility. The highest rates of mobility tend to be found in places like Utah, the sort of upper mountain states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and there's a lot of variation across cities as well. And then he's also tried to figure out, well, what sorts of aspects of communities are correlated, tend to go along with having a lot of mobility or having very little mobility. And there's a variety of things. He's tended to highlight a number of them. Social capital, he has tended to highlight as being important. He's got some more recent research on that has reinforced the importance of social capital. I believe rates of college education, like the percentage of adults that have a college education, the amount of inequality across the middle, so not looking at the top 1% that everybody was marching in the streets about 15 years ago, but just the amount of inequality kind of across the middle, the size of the middle class and how much income they have, and also segregation, economic segregation, but also racial segregation. Those are sort of the big factors that he's identified as at least, whether they're actually driving things or not is a much more complicated question, but the places that tend to have more or less of these things tend to have more or less social mobility.
Yeah. And the way in which...
And I'm sorry, the one I think I left out was rates of single parenthood also tends to show up pretty consistently in his work as well.
Yeah. Very good. And the nature of urban and metropolitan kind of dense areas in this country's really changed a lot in the last 40 years or so, which is also affecting people's ability to move up or stay, in whichever quintile that they were born in. I know if you look at the 15 most unequal metropolitan areas in the country in 1985, and that would be just a simple measure, the distance between the top 10% and the lowest 10% in the income distribution. About 8 of the 15 metro areas were in the South, mid-sized metros. None of the big coastal cities were in there. New Orleans would have been one of the cities in the South, but most of the rest of them would be what we call mid-sized metros today, cities of 200,000 people or so. Clearly a legacy of racial segregation, and this is 20 years after the Civil Rights Movement. When you fast forward to today, and you look at the top 15 most unequal metropolitan areas by the same division, there are no cities in the South. And it's all the coastal cities. It's the San Francisco's, it's the LA, it's the Washington, D.C., it's the New York. And so the nature of the sort of class-based segregation has really, really changed in the last 40 years. And that's really affecting people's ability to move up as well, and making it really hard to have some of those vibrant, intact neighborhoods in areas that are also growing where the opportunity is, right? So it's harder for people to raise their children in the areas where that are the most kind of dynamic growing places. How's that a segue for you?
That was great.
Yeah, okay.
Right, that was fantastic.
That's right. So John can't brag about this, so I will. If you've heard of the opportunity zones that were in the tax reform bill from a few years ago, that's John and his company. They did the research that led the way to the idea for the zones, which they developed in conjunction with Senator Scott, and at least Senator Scott, right? At first, it started with him, and then got incorporated into that tax bill, which is a new way to try to bring new investment into stagnating or disinvested areas, primarily in urban areas. So talk a little bit about that research, and and also it'd be great to get an update now that we've been a couple years into the opportunity zone thing. What is success actually looking like in those areas?
Yeah, great. Ryan, thanks. I want to extend my gratitude again to Pete and Melissa, as others have done, for helping me get here and inviting me to be a part of this great event. You asked earlier to make sure that we talk about what our organizations do and why. So I'm going to give a brief thumbnail on that. EIG was founded to focus on the two issues that we've talked about so far on this panel. One is the importance of place in human flourishing, and the second is economic dynamism. What are the conditions that lead to a dynamic and opportunity-rich society? And we launched EIG in 2015, really on the heels of some of the research that Scott was just talking about by the economist Raj Chetty, that shined a spotlight on the importance of place and added new dimensions to our understanding of just how important one's community of upbringing was to their life outcomes. So the neighborhood where a child grows up, how does that contribute to their life success down the road in all these different ways? And it turns out it contributes quite a bit, has a massive effect on people's ability to thrive over the long term. And going further back, the why for me is that's a question, the idea of moving to opportunity and why certain places are conducive, why certain conditions lead to people flourishing. That's something that goes back to part of my identity as a great-grandson of poor Italian immigrants who left a very poor part of Italy at a very rough time in that country's history, moved to the United States. My grandfather is the first born in the United States, born in the first year of the Great Depression, and yet within one generation, that whole family is doing well and thriving, and it really validated their decision to leave Italy and come here. But that always stuck with me as a kid, is what is it about places from one to the other? And that's carried forward into this work. So it is always in the back of my mind as a motivation. So this issue of, you asked about opportunity zones, that was really born out of, in the mid-2010s, we were still recovering from the shock of the Great Recession. This incredibly traumatic period of economic upheaval. And there was something about that recovery that felt and looked different compared to the previous recoveries we'd seen after recessions in the early 2000s, in the 1990s, and going further back. And one of the key differences, and my organization really, this was the first thing we did out of the gates, was try to study what are the differences? How can we look at and compare the recovery from the Great Recession to previous ones through the lens of place? Because we don't live, really, most people don't live in a national economy. That's an abstraction on some level. We live in places, we live in communities, we live in a local economy. That's our best gauge for the world. It's looking out the window and seeing, are there more jobs today than there were last year? Are there more businesses opening or closing? Do I see vacant storefronts? Are people getting jobs? Are people, fixing up their homes? That's what influences our understanding of the economy. I think much more tangibly than the notion of a national economy. So when we think about the health of the economy nationally, there's a lot of different ways to look at that. One of the lessons, I think, of our work is that we have to get beneath the aggregate national numbers and understand how the prosperity and growth of our country overall is really distributed out across places. That's such an important thing to understand, how people are experiencing the economy and how the economy today looks and feels different compared to previous eras. And as it turns out, the recovery from the Great Recession was disappointing on a lot of levels, but one of the reasons it was disappointing was because top and bottom places were pulling apart from each other in ways we didn't see in previous recoveries. If you look at the 1990s recovery, for example, it was small rural places that were actually leading the charge in new business growth and in new jobs in terms of the speed at which they were recovering. That completely inverts by the time you get to the 2010s recovery. And you have a very small, relatively small number of places that are doing phenomenally well and generating the lion's share of new jobs, new businesses, new population growth. And then you have the rest of the country kind of middling along, but at the bottom, that bottom tier of communities that we would look at it as the top and bottom 20%, bore almost no resemblance. You couldn't tell, looking at those communities, that there was a recovery at all. They were still in a recession deep into a national recovery. So the headline news would have been, looking at the aggregate numbers, the economy's back on its feet. But for 50, 60 million people, they're living in a community that's not true at all. We're still losing jobs. We're still losing businesses. We're still hollowing out. And policymaking and the national narrative just took a long time to catch up with that. When it did, it really did. You have the rise of Donald Trump. You have a more economic populist message that comes onto the scene 2016, 2017, 2018. And that whole narrative starts to shift, including in the economics profession, where place-based policy and the things that go along with that were more of a backwater before, and now they come to the forefront as, well, maybe we really should be doing something about this. Maybe we should be thinking about how to intervene on a place-based, on the basis of place to try to help spur growth in areas that were struggling. So out of some of that research and policy work came this idea for opportunity zones, which is really simple. It's just how do we get private capital off the sidelines to support growth in areas that are lagging in a market-based way. So now we're 4+ years into the life of that policy. I actually spent my morning yesterday in South LA with a person who is now the biggest affordable housing developer in that part of the city, who really was able to scale up because of the Opportunity Zones incentive. And he was taking me around South LA, showing me where there's all these vacant parcels of land, all these burned out storefronts where there's just nothing going on. And I bought that, and I bought that, and I bought that. And what you add that all up, it's thousands of new housing units, it's new retail, it's new business that are going to be coming into those areas. So you asked, what's the scorecard? Unfortunately, we lack data. We only have narrative, to Bob's point right now, because we're still waiting on the definitive data to tell us how it's going. But the early indications are that it's showing a lot of success at a time when we desperately need, now with COVID, desperately need more tools and more resources to help those types of lagging communities do well. But what will ultimately be the scorecard that I pay most attention to is the new business side. And this gets back to the point of dynamism. Contrary to the way that a lot of people think about the economy now, we are actually much less dynamic today than we were in previous decades. This gets back to some of what was talked about in earlier panels. There's this nostalgia for a bygone period where people were more stable, where people had more stable careers, where they were more rooted in their communities. None of that is true. We're stable today compared to the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, and before. People have fewer jobs, they do less job hopping, they move less, significantly less. Fewer new businesses are being formed. We have the velocity of creative destruction is much lower today. And I think that's part of what's immiserating about our economy, not what's liberating about it. When we took the title of this is Mass Flourishing. That's our panel title. People flourish in dynamic economies. People flourish when they have a lot of opportunities to fulfill their potential. And that is based on a lot of movement and sorting and resorting, and the ability to respond to shocks by picking up and moving to a better labor market. Doing what my great-grandparents did, leaving a country and finding opportunity elsewhere. That's the most extreme version of this. But within our big, diverse country, we have so many different labor markets, so many different industries, so many different opportunities. People in the past used to respond to those economic conditions and say, great, go pursue it. We were a pioneer country, a frontier country. And so there's a tension there, because we want people to be rooted, and we want people to be stable on some level, but stability and rootedness can often slide into sclerosis and stuckness. And the stuckness of our country is up, a 50% rise in people who say, I am stuck in a community I want to get out of, compared to the 1970s, 50% higher. So I think as we think about what leads to flourishing, we need to think about that kind of state of flux and change and the healthy dynamism that leads to those opportunities, and where the role of policy is. That's something we spend a lot of time on.
Those are good points, and actually that raises a question of what it actually means to enjoy the stability of a healthy community life while also taking advantage of the pack up and move thing when it's time to do that, and what that looks like. Because a lot of times it's not moving 2,000 miles from one city to another. It can be moving across the metro area from a stuck place to a place that's got better opportunity. I know when I the very first time I ever had thoughts of this was the very same time I got interested in urban policy. I was a college freshman. I was in Chicago. I had a community service assignment as part of my obligation to my school, and I was assigned to a faith-based community service program right at the foot of the Henry Horner homes in Chicago. And this was in the 80s. This was before Hope 6. This was before all the public housing reform. And after about 2 months of going in and mentoring 12 to 14-year-old boys, all of whom were gang recruits, all of whose older brothers were in trouble, and I showed up, and I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and Indianapolis with my blue and pink striped Izod and my Sperry topsiders and khakis, I gotta get a new outfit. Yeah, that's right. And I learned so much from their older brothers who came back. And I learned a lot about the role of grandmothers in their lives. But the thing that really stuck out to me was how stuck they were in these gallery buildings. I didn't grow up in a particularly political home, didn't really have ideas about policy, but after about 3 months of driving back and forth, I remember thinking, whose idea was this? to put people in places like this where the police don't even really patrol. There's no parks for the kids. There's just concrete. There's nothing here except this horrible place with pock marks in the walls where the gangs would hole up and shoot at each other. And I started reading, and I read about the model cities and the Great Society, and then there was this congressman from New York named Jack Kemp who was singing a different song and was actually describing the boys that I was mentoring incredibly accurately from my experience, future entrepreneurs and that. It's funny, incidentally, it was also when someone gave me a copy of The Conservative Mind, so I was reading Russell Kirk about the same time and forming my thoughts. It was just a couple years later, also thanks to Kemp and others, and I'm sure, Bob, you were involved in this too, that when the Hope 6 public housing reforms tore all that stuff down and replaced it with vouchers and mixed income neighborhoods, it also created this big demonstration program called Moving to Opportunity that gave some families vouchers to move out of those places into other places. And that became the data that the first Raj Chetty set of studies that Scott was talking about was based on. You fast forward all those years, and then some of those 8-year-olds are now 30 years old, and some of those 15-year-olds are in their 40s, and they're able to trace what happened, and found that the people who stayed in place suffered the kinds of outcomes you would expect. Their interactions with law enforcement were consistent with what was going on in that particular zip code, and every other kind of negative indicator you could look at. But where the people that left that area, especially if they were under the age of 8 or 10, like the younger you are, and you move into a community that has some of the features that Scott was talking about, more two-parent homes, better schools, less crime, and all of that, and the outcomes of those kids really match the outcomes of the kids into the neighborhood where they moved, and not where they came from. So that's one of the kind of the best sort of examples of how social capital can really make a difference. But they had to move, and I think that was one of the things. When my light bulbs first started coming on very early in my development was this idea of not being able to take advantage of opportunity. And the story you're telling right now is one that's still, it says we're very much suffering from this for a whole bunch of reasons that people, sounds like a lot of people want to go someplace else, but they can't. And they can't for certain reasons. And so what do you think some of those reasons are that prevent people from being able to even just move across town to a better set of neighborhoods? And then what are the implications for policy? Do either of you have?
So John may know about this better than I do. My understanding from what I've read, there's a few factors involved. I think some of the stuff that gets studied is, I think, first it is important to acknowledge that there remains a fair amount of discrimination in housing and lending in terms of, and it's mostly like a very subtle thing. It's not sort of people being rejected for a loan, but it's sort of the neighborhoods that people are shown, when they're looking for a home or whatever, are very different depending on your demographics. So that's one factor. I think cost is obviously a huge factor. Rather than sort of, I think as people have sort of fled the problems of major cities in the United States for the suburbs, one of the convenient aspects of doing that is that you don't have to erect barriers to living in your neighborhood. You don't have to set up a gated community. You don't have to discriminate. You just have to live in a place that's so far out or so expensive to live in that other people can't afford to live there. But additionally, one of the reasons why those places oftentimes are so expensive is because there are zoning regulations and land use regulations set up in a myriad set of ways, from you can't build multifamily housing, or your lawn has to be a certain size, or we're just not going to mess up the great views of places like Malibu, and so we can't build on some of these areas to the extent that we might. Those also keep people from moving. I do think it's easy to sort of think about ways that are amenable to policy that might create more residential mobility, and I think we ought to address for sure. I think this is a very complicated set of factors too. So if you're, in Washington D.C., one of the poorer neighborhoods, it's a big neighborhood, sort of meta neighborhood is Anacostia, kind of on the southeast side of St. Louis, across the Anacostia River. And it's the sort of place that's so isolated in many ways that there are kids who grew up there and have rarely been to Northwest DC, which is the mostly white part of DC. So we're not talking about the suburbs. We're talking about a place you could access if you hop on a bus or on a subway. And so there is this residential segregation that produces social isolation and creates these circumstances where are you going to be the first person to sort of raise your hand and move to a neighborhood where you don't have your immediate family there, you don't necessarily have good friends there, you're legitimately concerned about the reception to your living there in that neighborhood. That can also be true with sort of regional moves to a different city, to a different part of the United States. I think especially in low-income families, lots of times extended families really depend on each other. Networks of friends really depend on each other for safety net, private safety net purposes in a way that a lot of upper middle class families don't need to worry about. And so if you move, you're sort of cutting yourself off from an informal safety net. You're not necessarily going to be able to help the other people in your family who maybe don't have the opportunities that you do or haven't been as successful as you. So I think there's a whole complicated set of issues that do make it difficult to increase the sort of migration rates that John's talking about. In the past, those issues were overcome. I think we were all a little bit more risk taking 50, 100 years ago than we are today. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the urban North. The migration of Appalachian whites to the industrial Midwest. There was just a lot more dynamism back then than there is today. So I don't know the extent to which we can sort of go back to that, or the extent to which we've just changed and become sort of less risky as a society.
Well, what would concern me less is if we saw the decline in geographic mobility, but no increase in the response of people saying, I'm stuck, I feel stuck and wish I could move.
Yep.
That would suggest that people are happy with their options and they've sorted into places they feel comfortable with. The fact that people want to move and can't, the fact that we see a decline in mobility at the same time that we know that there's a self-induced housing crisis. I think housing is really at the heart of this whole conversation where there is almost a reflexive view that people are the problem, and if we just keep people out of here, that somehow that's either good for the environment or good for communities, and so we've become very unwelcoming through a lot of our country. The places with the most opportunity, the things that would have been a magnet in previous eras that would have drawn people in, and those places would have accommodated them. Again, I'll go back to New York City and the Italian immigrants and the Irish immigrants, all the people that flooded in from all over the country and all over the world. They accommodated those. They built housing. Those cities changed. When my great-grandparents moved to Queens, it was farmland, right? So think about how much that's changed over the last 100 years. Now we've become a country where a lot of the most opportunity-rich places are essentially gated communities, where we're not letting you in. We're not going to build more housing. We're not going to make it affordable. So you have this sorting such that in 1980, a poor person in this country was more likely to live in a very low poverty community than they were in a very high poverty community. I'll say it again, a poor person, a person who's experiencing individual poverty, was more likely to live in a very low poverty community than a high poverty community. Today, it's the opposite. If you're poor, you're more likely to live in a very high poverty community than a very low poverty community. All that to say, we've become more economically sorted and homogenous. People who are wealthy, more affluent, they tend to live among like kind. Poorer people tend to live around poorer people. It creates exactly the kind of conditions, going back to Rod Shetty now for the third or fourth time in this panel, Rod Shetty finds that economic segregation is bad for upward mobility. Well, we're creating more of those economically segregated communities over the decades, such that we have doubled the number of high poverty communities in this country between 1980 and 2018. Double. Poverty has gone down. So it's not that we're much more impoverished as a country. Poverty rate is down. We're actually doing much better at dealing with individual poverty. But the geographic, the spatial sorting of people, which we know really matters for their life outcomes, what they're surrounded by, has become much worse. And we've become much more segregated economically, slightly less segregated racially in those same communities. But the economic segregation is a policy-induced failure. It's not an inevitability of capitalism or this economic system we've got, it's because public policy bit by bit has made it harder and harder to build, harder and harder to sort, harder and harder to move into areas of opportunity, and then that feeling of stuckness and the economic results of that. We see that borne out in all these other data points, the consequences of that stuckness, and that's a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kevin Faulconer, who's the former mayor of San Diego, who was in the first panel today, is, to my knowledge anyway, the mayor of the largest city in the country to actually try to start making some of these reforms to free up land for building and to deal with the problem of costly housing by producing more of it, which that's been a real shift even in just in my professional life dealing in public policy over the last 20 years, where if you go back 15 years ago, people were just starting to read this research that Ed Glazer and others were doing about how restrictions on land were actually driving up the price of housing. But the discussions back then were all about subsidies. What's the right kind of mix of subsidies to try to, we're going to just drive up the cost of housing and then try to have the government make it less painful for people to buy a house. Now it's finally shifted where everyone across the ideological spectrum from right to left basically agrees that the reason we have these problems that you're talking about, high concentrations of poverty and then neighborhoods that people, even with, in some cases, decent middle class incomes can't access, is because of the way we've kind of zoned affordable housing right out of cities. And so the fact that some mayors are starting to experiment with that now is at least a positive sign, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. One thing that on that point that I wanted to make before we turn to some questions is that what we've found in some of our survey work over the last few years, which we didn't go looking for but kind of popped out in our surveys, is that the way that neighborhoods are designed really matters for people's sense of attachment to where they are, their sense of place that John was talking about a little bit ago. And we found that when we look at how far people are, whether by foot or by car or public transport or a bicycle, from some core amenities like your grocery store, a park, your kids' school if you have kids in school, the gym, the things when you're not at home and you're not at work, or you're not at home and you're not at school, where are you? When you have access to a decent mix of those, you generally tend to rate your community as a better, safer, happier place to live than the people who don't. And so there is something to that that informal engagement, running into each other. And it was a happy finding for me in many ways, because it sort of validated the fourth mediating structure to empower people that hasn't gotten the attention over the years that the other three has. And Bob made reference to that earlier in terms of the work with Peter Berger and then Richard John Newhouse and that great publication, which really made the notion of mediating structures that Nisbet wrote about, but made it really sort of part of the language of policymakers. There were four mediating structures, right? There were families, there were religious congregations, there were local charities or nonprofits, and then there were neighborhoods was the fourth one. And since that book was published, the first three have been subjected to a lot of research, and that's why we really know now in ways that we can demonstrate the obvious, that families matter, but that congregations matter, and that charities matter when it comes to building social capital, building those kinds of civil society effects at the local level. But we're finding that neighborhoods do that. And Seth made reference to the third places earlier, that when people have access to these various neighborhood institutions and use them, they tend to trust people more. They're more likely to say yes when asked to volunteer. They're more likely, like I said, to rate their neighborhood better than someone who doesn't make use of those things. People that walk their dogs in dog parks really like their neighborhoods, we found. Dogs, and you think about that. Think all the people you know. If you have a dog, think all the people you wouldn't know if you didn't have a dog. So that matters. But here's the thing. That when you control for every demographic and you control for income, the effects are the same everywhere. But who do you think lives in the communities that gets to enjoy all those things right now? A much more affluent, wealthier slice of the population. And in those neighborhoods that you're talking about, they're also characterized by what I was talking about in my experience in Chicago all those years ago, where those kids and those parents don't have access to those things. So the repeated engagement with human beings is just very different than that repeated engagement when you're walking into the coffee shop and don't even know the last name of the barista who's called Karen on the name tag, but you start learning about community events just by while you're waiting in line, and those things actually do matter. So when we're thinking about affordable housing, we should really be thinking about affordable communities, and when we're developing housing that's affordable for people through these reforms, we should be thinking about the whole neighborhood, and I know you guys are doing some of that in the zones as well. I want to make sure we have time for questions. I want to keep us on time because I know, for, like many of you who've moderated panels over the year, you have to worry about different things at different times of day. You know, if you're the first panel of the day, everyone's caffeinated. You can turn to questions earlier because people always have something to say. If you're the panel right after lunch, you have to be really engaging, like Josh was, or you just have to be funny because when people are digesting the food. But when you're the last panel standing between people and the cocktail hour, you gotta finish on time. So I will take questions. Is it okay if we take questions from the floor? Will those be recorded as well if we go? Yeah, back here.
For John, and depending on your answer, a follow-up question. The bipolarity of the recovery, the 2010s, how much of that was a result of TARP and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and where the government was actually investing those funds?
I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer to that because I've spent years practicing unsatisfying answers. The reason that was not a satisfying recovery, most fundamentally, was because I would say we misjudged how hot we could run the economy and how tight we could run the labor market, and didn't learn that lesson fully until late in that business cycle. So all of a sudden you had 2018, 2019, early 2020. If you look at what the unemployment rate looked like then, we were still adding hundreds of thousands of jobs a month, way beyond the point at which the traditional target would have said, well, that's about full employment. We were down in the high twos of the unemployment rate. We were pulling people who had previously registered as disabled, unable to work. They were coming back into the labor market. So we set the wrong targets. I would say monetary policy played a role in this, right? It was unhelpful to a speedy recovery. Of course, TARP and other measures I think were imperfect after the Great Recession, but if we fast forward to this latest crisis, we actually have a useful point of comparison. Of course, huge flaws in the coronavirus relief response. One of the flaws that we couldn't level was too slow or too small, right? It was a big, fast response that that stabilized the economy first and foremost because individuals were not pulling back on spending in a dramatic way. The individual household balance sheets were solid. Even poor people saw their household spending go up because they had the resources to fill that gap. As a result of that, unlike the post-Great Recession recovery, you saw a huge spike and continue to see a huge spike in entrepreneurship during the most turbulent period imaginable. Why? Because there's actually a market to go serve. People are not pulled back on consumer spending. They're unafraid. Also, in part because it's not a financial crisis the way the Great Recession was. So there were some features of this that were different. But one big feature was we went fast and quick and big with the response. I would argue we kept doing that for too long with this recovery, and the last round was unnecessary. But early on, stepping into that breach and making sure that we filled the gap in a way that was very different than what we did during the Great Recession allowed the recovery to happen differently here. Now we have a different set of problems, but again, it's not a weak labor market recovery. We're already very low again on unemployment. We're seeing a really strong response to the point of actually having a problem with inflation because of how strong the response is in some ways. So I'd say that's the fundamental problem there, is that we were afraid to pull the trigger at the scale that we should have and at the speed that we should have in the response to the Great Recession.
Yes, Bob, and then Seth.
Just curious, is it helpful to use the word segregation regarding income and housing? Because it implies intentionality, and it plays into that narrative. But do you really mean income and housing separation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think this doesn't justify the use of it. I think academics tend to use segregation in a way that doesn't necessarily. It's not supposed to mean. It's not supposed to imply like what the reason for geographic differences is. It's not supposed to imply that it's discrimination. That it's. Yeah, it's just a word that academics use, like social capital. I don't know.
I would not hold back on
No.
using segregation in the intentional sense. If you look at least in a large share of why there's not housing supply in a lot of areas, it is quite intentional. We don't want lower income people to live in our neighborhood. We have a certain community character, and we don't want to change it. And you can take whatever undertones to that And that may be variable from person to person, but that is economic, at the very least, economic segregation by design.
Yeah,
And,
I think that for some of the reasons I was talking about earlier, 15 years ago when it was very much an academic question about how land use planning was resulting in house price spikes. Now that is such a well-known finding and agreed upon that's kind of like the jig's up here in California in a way too, right, Pete? I mean, it's like you're noticing a shift in the discussion because people can't hide behind the 1% anymore or the tech billionaires or whatever. It's like too many people know now that we don't have enough housing because jurisdictions are keeping it from being built. And it's getting harder for public officials to hide behind that, to run from that fact. So if it wasn't intentional 15 years ago, increasingly it is, at least by neglect, I think.
If you ever want to go down a rabbit hole of depression and sadness, go look up how people respond in some of these neighborhood associations when someone wants to build a duplex. A duplex, we're not talking about a skyscraper of apartment buildings, a duplex, an accessory dwelling unit. This is what gets people up in arms. And bit by bit, over time, those types of things jam up the gears of being able to be responsive to people's actual needs. It delays household formation because people can't afford. There's all these downstream problems. It's not just that an individual can't go move to an area, it's that that same individual can't afford to buy a home until much later. They delay starting a family. You see birth rates go down. All this stuff is related. So there's kind of a housing theory of everything that's involved here. And it does come down to people who have co-opted the system of laws and land use and regulation to their benefit to protect their fiefdom of this is my property. I want to control what other people do with their property so that mine stays valuable.
And what's amazing is when it does get built, and then you have more units of housing in an area and more amenities around there, everyone moves there.
It's funny how that works.
And it drives the prices up. So there needs to be more of it, not less. Generally, people are happy with the outcome, but the resistance is unbelievable. Seth, yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. I wonder if each of you very quickly could tell me if you were a governor, a mayor, or a county executive, if you're in rural areas, what's the one thing you would do to increase social capital in your area, in your jurisdiction?
Can I have two?
You can do three. I'd like to make it quick.
Okay. The first thing that I would do would be to invest, hopefully by being able to use federal resources already at my disposal to do it, in creating really good information technology on people's phones about where the best places are to get trained for the best kinds of growing jobs in the economy, in the regional economy. For one, because that data exists, but people don't have access to it. You can find out the best Thai restaurant in your neighborhood, but you can't figure out which sectors of your local economy are growing the fastest and where are the best places to go get skills there. And then use some of that money to help people achieve that by buying their bus tickets, by giving them enough money to fill gas in their car, to get people out and finding the ability to pursue their whatever it is that they want to do. Because the relationships they form in that process of pursuing an education are usually the ones that really people leverage. I mean, those kind of weak ties and strong ties matter for people's upward mobility. The second would be just to fight the fight to get more overlay zones on existing zoning, just to allow for the multiple uses, much like the mayor was talking about this morning, making it possible to divide up 1 acre into 4 units, that kind of a thing, so that more people with lower means can actually move into neighborhoods closer to where the jobs are and where there's better schools and that kind of a thing. So the worker mobility thing and then the housing mobility thing would be the two I'd focus on.
We may all end up saying the same thing because I echo those as well. It also obviously matters what's your starting baseline. If public safety is a huge problem, you're going to want to tackle that right out of the gates to set the preconditions for people to have kind of associational life in a safe way and a way that's oriented around families. So families need housing and they need safety. If you don't have those two things, social capital is not going to flourish. So a lot of what you talked about earlier as well. I mean, those are preconditional type of things. If you have a Venice Beach type of situation, then what you do first, I think, is going to reflect that, or should reflect that.
I would largely agree with those two. I mean, I think my advice to policymakers probably would, I'd probably get a nice pat on the head and then be shown the door. The zoning, I think is really important in the land use regulations. Unfortunately, the battle you're fighting there is against constituents at the end of the day, right? The reason we have these things is because voters want them. So it's the kind of problem where, the problem is us. It's sort of, we can't blame the top 1%, or we can't blame conservatives, we can't blame liberals. It's sort of incumbents that benefit from the status quo, which is middle class and upper middle class folks broadly. My other advice would also be terrible practical advice, but I would lobby the feds to pursue an agenda of sort of federalization, decentralization. Some of the issues that have come up today already in terms of crowd out. I think the federal government, federal policy has tended to crowd out a lot of things that communities used to do. And it's crowded out even roles, as I think Joshua said, that the family used to perform. Some of those roles need to be returned to communities and to families, because the sort of muscles of social capital, of being able to solve things together, have really atrophied, because we rely so much on federal policy these days, or state policy, when it used to be the communities would sort of figure out these things on their own. I think that fundamentally, restoring levels of social capital in poor and non-poor communities is going to require giving people more of an opportunity to serve valuable roles in their community, to solve problems together, through the messiness of interacting with each other. And the only way that's going to happen is if we can sort of devolve some responsibilities in a responsible way down to the local level. Obviously, you don't want to sort of, Mississippi is in a much weaker position to sort of take care of its poverty than Connecticut is, right? And so there still needs to be a federal role that says we're going to help. Mississippi's going to get a little bit more help from the federal government. Connecticut's going to get a little bit less. Whether a mayor or governor would be receptive to my brilliant advice, I'm a little skeptical.
And I should just add the caveat to that because the question was about if we were mayors or public officials, we're looking at policy issues that deal with some of these blockages to mobility and the ability to get people into communities where they can form the kinds of relationships that really create that rich social capital. But it doesn't mean that's the most important thing. It's hard as a mayor to know what to do to get more people to darken the door of the religious congregation close to where they live. But at the end of the day, I think it's pretty hard to argue with the faith-based association at the neighborhood level being the most powerful generator. Involving them in efforts, involving them in the provision of services and all those things is key, and it's fundamental, and I believe in it, and I've worked on it before. And I think that any mayor who cares about that in their city would have to be doing that kind of work in addition to some of these ideas, for sure.
That's a great point.
Totally agree.
Yeah. I first met Bob in Steve Goldsmith's office all those years ago, back when he was the mayor of Indianapolis, and had this thing called the Front Porch Alliance, which was a partnership with faith-based and community organizations, devolving neighborhood services to them, everything from public safety initiatives to park cleanup projects and all those things. And it was hugely successful. And we studied it afterwards too, and did an evaluation. And the neighborhoods that had utilized their formal partnerships with neighborhood associations on specific projects saw outcomes that were heads and shoulders above the other neighborhoods that didn't. There were 8 target neighborhoods, as I recall, and the ones that had the most successful outcomes, the reductions in teen pregnancy, or the reductions in infant deaths and those sorts of things that were initiatives of the neighborhood, they were entirely carried out by religious organizations in partnership with associations. And then the other neighborhoods that didn't get their act together didn't really see a change in the outcome. So you could attribute it to those partnerships, for sure. I'll take one more question. I want to be mindful of our time. Yeah.
So I apologize, this is not my area of expertise, but it sounds very interesting, something you guys brought up quite a bit around housing. One of the things I'm curious about is the U.S. has traditionally put a heavy emphasis on housing ownership. We've seen that, Black households in particular, not having access to housing ownership has really affected poverty in some ways, compared to, say, Europe, where there's, my understanding is, lower levels of housing ownership. And wondering if, the fact that you own a house makes you more invested in your property value, and, how land zoning laws are decisions are made. Is there an interest in changing how we view housing ownership in terms of making people more open to changes in zoning regulations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can start.
I'll take a swing at it. Home ownership as a public policy goal has been a long-standing. Bill Clinton had an initiative. George W. Bush after him. I worked, full disclosure, worked for Bush on some of that stuff. And when policymakers get involved in trying to promote home ownership, it leads to a lot of policy decisions that sometimes can contribute to huge problems like what we experience. And so my view on this is a little conflicted, because you're right that when people actually own their own home and they have a stake in their neighborhood, they're more engaged in their neighborhood too. And so you find higher levels of social capital in ownership neighborhoods than renter ones. But I always just feel like we need to caveat that push and not make people who decide to choose to rent for particular reasons and save and invest their money in other things, that they're making somehow an inferior choice if that's what they decide to do. And in some places that might actually just be the best outcome for that family. There is some interesting literature too, just on the total cost of home ownership. And even though I've owned 4 homes over the last 25 years, and all of them sold in good markets, and we did well and all that stuff. But when I go back and I add up all we put into those homes, that gap narrows a bit. And so sometimes you can be more involved in your community and pursue other things when you're freed up from the headaches of home ownership as well. So I guess for my view, that the punchline is just that we should have a blend. People need to have options. And we should live in really nice, rich neighborhoods with lots of amenities where people want to rent a smaller place where they can walk to the store, or buy a place where they can walk to the store. Both of those things should be possible. And I think any really smart development plan should include both.
Why, to your last point about Steve Goldsmith,
Yeah.
why have policymakers and Republicans paid any attention to what this man did in this city? Because that's a prototype of what a conservative governance looks like. And
Yeah.
There are very few models of conservative being able to govern conservatively.
Mm-hmm.
As Steve Goldsmith did. But there was, again,
Yeah.
no attention to what
And the people loved him for it. He was an incredibly popular mayor as well. I know it's probably a longer discussion about what trying to create a national policy in the Bush years did for that as well. It kind of got overshadowed, after 9/11, and it became sort of a side project of the administration rather than its central, reason for being. Which, when I first signed up, that's what it was. He was going to be a domestic policy president, and that was going to anchor it. And then the events post 9/11 and the wars and all of that really just took kind of a lot of attention off of it, and it never was able to kind of work its way into the bloodstream, I think, of policymakers. And then just with everything else that happened, people kind of forgot about it. And now we've swung this other way where we're talking about just kind of nationalizing everything. There's a real interest in running the country from Washington right now across the political spectrum. So that's why people like us need to be gathered this way. Which maybe, to tie it back to some earlier discussions and the historical legacy that Russell Kirk's had here when, his name's come up a few times today. When he wrote The Conservative Mind, it was titled The Conservative Route because it was his doctoral dissertation at the University of St. Andrews, which I feel closely connected to since both my kids have gone there. Michael Hendricks, also graduate. But sent it to the publisher with the title Conservative Route because he figured he was chronicling for the past. This disposition that hopefully one day would be recovered again. So there have been dark times before, and there have been times when it seems like the best ideas won't take root, but then they have, and that's a real reason for why we're gathered here today, is to try to replicate that sort of an effort. Thanks for having us today. Thanks for sticking with us to the end. I think are we finding our? Can you say what we're doing next? Since Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to the panel. A great way to finish the afternoon's agenda, but it does continue. You should have in your folders this page outlining very quick directions, about 15 minutes to drive to Spruzzo's, which is about 10 miles north of here, right on Coast Highway. It's within essentially a strip mall type place, but it's a really great restaurant, outdoor and indoor, and would love it for you to all join us there to continue these conversations. Just seeing old and new friends here looking out, and just very grateful for all of you for joining us for what I believe are really some fundamentally important conversations about not only where we are in our policy set of conversations in the country, but where we are in our politics as well. I had mentioned at the jump this morning that my hope was that this would be inspirational, and I'm seeing nodding heads, and also others just have come up to me at the breaks just to say, yeah, I really feel it's the first time I've felt encouraged about a political conversation in a long time. And I really do believe that this is why the policy school exists, but I think this has always kind of been the genius of the American project that's now transitioned into the new Mises Institute, is that we are having fundamentally different conversations about politics and policy. But as can sometimes happen in events like this, I'm also seeing what I was hoping for, which was new relationships being built, and people saying, "Oh, you think this way too?" Because I think that is very much about what the importance of having this institutionalized is about, is that it provides an opportunity to gather people together to highlight the great work that is happening, and then to continue to engage and build what I believe is a movement around this communitarian approach to our politics and policy, which is really so genuinely American, as Josh outlined so well in his luncheon remarks. So again, please join us up at Spruzzo's, and again, back at it tomorrow morning with a couple great panels and a concluding conversation at lunch, and look forward to continuing today's conversation up the street. Thanks so much.